All right, so you're probably familiar with the term the Enlightenment. Hope you can see my screen there. It usually has a positive connotation. Just think of what the term means. Of course, it's not just for this 18th century intellectual movement in Europe. Enlightenment is a term that relates to religions. So in Buddhism in particular, there is this concept of reaching a spiritual state of understanding where everything's clarified. You see the world as it really is. You understand how it all fits together, and you understand your place in it. So I think there's, it doesn't exactly mean the same thing, but the Enlightenment has that whole idea is we're bringing the light of reason, the light of science, onto the affairs of humans to make the world a better place in so many different ways. However you measure that, maybe people will live longer, they'll be more comfortable, they'll have a greater access to experiences and opportunities, there'll be less inequality, more social mobility, they'll have more access to goods, knowledge, there'll be new methods and means of transportation. So whatever you can take of the human experience and turn it into like a science, which is what would be called the social sciences, that's what the Enlightenment is attempting to do. And it's trying to do it in this somewhat systematic way. They're trying to create a system of knowledge to try to make the world better and more rational. And that usually means moving away from tradition. So the 18th century in many ways is kind of this transition into the modern age. So you might remember I used this schema before of like overlapping circles, like a Venn diagram. So one of those is the medieval approach to things, whether that's like feudalism or manorialism, like weaker, softer states. And then there's modernism, which is we associate with more scientific and technological approaches to things, a more developed and complex infrastructure. And then the period that's in between where they overlap is called the early modern period. So we're really moving more into modern with the Enlightenment. However, at the same time, it's clear that there are features of society which are not really changing all that much in the 18th century. So we're just going to look at how that goes. So demographically, the 18th century was a period of steady population growth from about 120 million in 1700 until about 190 million on the eve of the French Revolution. And this is really primarily due not to an increasing birth rate, but to a declining death rate. For whatever reason, transportation improved slightly. You had canals, you had roads that improved somewhat. You had better access to food. The weather improved. The Little Ice Age ended kind of around 1720. And for whatever reason, the bubonic plague really didn't strike Europe in any significant way after the 1720s. However, most cities were still, by our standards today, pretty unsanitary. Infectious diseases still spread pretty significantly. But the population did increase, which some people thought was a basis for optimism. All right, so except in some places in Eastern Europe where they had a different tax structure, the family in Europe tended to be the nuclear family. It was still pretty much the core social unit. So a nuclear family is parents, children, and maybe you have one elderly relative who lives with the family. And basically you had what's called a family economy. So it wasn't like the father went off to the factory and the woman stayed home and made casseroles and the children went off to school. This is like you work together as a family for the means of subsistence. And the European marriage pattern was still relatively common, except in some places, particularly England. And one of the phenomenon that occurred here, which is, historians trying to explain, is the rate of illegitimacy, which is the number of children born out of wedlock. And this is a major theme in literature, because the first novels really were published in the 18th century, and one of those themes is sort of like the foundling, the orphan who's abandoned by their parents and then kind of rises up in a society. So there's a lot of different explanations. The one that makes the most sense to me is a lot of people migrated from rural areas because of increases in productivity, and so a lot of small landholders were thrown off the land, and so they went to cities, and they were no longer under the control of communal norms, enforcements, and parents, and so maybe there was more promiscuity, and thus the out-of-wedlock births. Okay? And there really weren't artificial means of birth control, like birth control pills or condoms, but there were some traditional practices. Mostly it's believed that just the desire to limit the number of children will, in the aggregate, tend to reduce population growth. Okay? So as you read in the article, if you finish the article, also what emerged during this period were new views of childhood. So especially in the second half of the 18th century. And this was mostly influenced by the ideas of a British thinker, John Locke, who wrote some thoughts concerning education in the 1690s, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, French thinker, who wrote the book Émile, which is a whole novel about a child being educated according to sort of more of a naturalistic approach. That was published in the 1760s. So These thinkers tended to view children as more innocent. So you might remember some of the previous documents we've looked at. The Calvinist minister who sees children as being little sprigs of Adam and like potential of being very sinful with harsh punishments. The whole idea of like the rule of thumb where a father can hit his children or his wife with a ruler that's no thicker than his thumb. So a lot of that is still present, especially in the lower classes. But new ideas emphasize like trying to bring children along and according to a developmental path, like with age-appropriate games, books that have illustrations in big print, clothing that's not so tight and swaddling the child. Most people were peasants, so they weren't able to access the city because children still had to contribute to the family income. And one of the big problems this time period, because of the increasing population and still high rates of poverty, was infanticide. In fact, Maria Theresa in Austria prohibited, common sleeping, and it wasn't because of sexual reasons per se. It was mostly because of children being killed. Although parents claimed it was an accident by rolling over the children in the middle of the night and suffocating them. All right, so one of the major reasons for optimism in some people's eyes was the agricultural revolution of the 18th century. This is not the beginnings of agriculture, in the ancient world. This is basically like the application of new scientific principles to agriculture. And there were some like real scientific thinkers like Charles Turnip Townsend and Jethro Tull, both British. The two countries that led the way were the Netherlands and England or Great Britain. And they just believed that you could increase the yield of both crops and the size of livestock by using different methods. Okay, maybe that was like by using, for example, a hoe, which aerates the soil and makes it more productive. Also, the seed drill, which is a machine that pushes the seed down beneath the soil, as opposed to the old broadcast method where you just like have a little bag of seed on your hip and you just throw it in the ground, and then of course it get washed away or birds would eat it. So this is like more organized, like scientifically produced agriculture. And a lot of this had to do with new crops that were available because of the Columbian Exchange. Maize, which is what we would call corn, and most importantly is the potato. So the potato really was a miracle savior crop because it really doesn't take a lot of attention. It has a high yield of calories per acre. In fact, in Ireland, which became very dependent on it, a whole family could subsist on like a half an acre or maybe an acre of potatoes. And you can do so many things with potatoes, I'm sure you know. French fries, potato pancakes, you can make soups and gruels out of them, you can mix them into different things. It took a little while for them to be adopted because they are kind of strange looking. People thought they caused disease or superstitions about them. But they became a basic staple of the diet. In fact, Frederick the Great played a little reverse psychology on his people. He really wanted them to plant potatoes. So what he did is he created potato fields outside of major cities, and then he posted like armed guards around them. So people are like, what's so valuable in the fields that the armed guards are there? And then the armed guards would leave at night, and then people would sneak in to like look up what the potatoes were, and then they would eat them because they thought, oh, this must be really valuable. Or he created these like big banquets where the people just prepared potatoes in different ways and fed them to people, and they're like, these are really good, so they adopted the potatoes since Prussia didn't really have the greatest agriculture or the most productive resources. So also there was the enclosure movement, which had started first in England, which is like basically getting rid of the common lands and putting it under the control of those who were going to introduce machinery and new scientific methods to increase crop yields. That also meant that small landholders kind of were pushed off the farm. And then instead of the old three-crop rotation, where you have one of the fields that's fallow, in other words, nothing's growing on it so that it can be replenished, now the discovery of nitrogen-rich crops, which have a sort of like a fertilizing effect, especially fodder crops like turnips and rutabagas, which can be eaten by livestock. You plant those instead, and that like replenishes the soil. And then you also have the food that the livestock can eat, and then they create manure, and then that actually improves it just as well. All right, so in terms of just like a little snapshot of the social order, certainly at the top were the aristocracy. And if you were a young male aristocrat when you're like came of age, let's say 20, 21, you would go on what's called the Grand Tour. There's an illustration of it here. So this was like you visiting famous historical sites, museums, maybe if you were religious sites, depending on what your religion was. And you can imagine sort of the things that young men got involved in as they were making their way across Europe, maybe without a chaperone, maybe a group of young men. But this was still sort of like a sign of your nobility. However, at the same time, there was still a pretty high rate of poverty. A lot of countries still had to deal with begging as a social problem and what to do with beggars. This just goes to show that even though more wealth was being produced in the 18th century, it was clearly not evenly distributed. And cities, probably if you went to visit them, wouldn't be clean. There was still human waste that was dumped in places without being treated. You had alleys that were dirty and disgusting. There was there was standing water, which could be the breeding grounds for disease. And so cities were often overwhelmed, their infrastructure, by people moving in from the countryside. Guilds still played a major role in the social and economic life of many cities, although in the Enlightenment they came under increasing criticism because they didn't really allow the free market of goods and manufacturing to take place. So many countries, especially France, still had a legally defined class structure. So it's 3 estates. The first estate was the clergy, those who pray. The second estate was the nobility, those who fight. And then the third estate was basically everyone else, peasants and middle class, who produced with their hands. So many of the philosophes criticize this artificial system, but at the same time don't assume that people like Voltaire or Hume were Democrats, because we're talking people who were uneducated, who were superstitious, who still believed in medieval tales of knights, and who attributed explanations to God, still believed in maybe even witchcraft. And so just because they criticized the system didn't mean they wanted to be ruled by the masses. So with the advance in commerce and the agricultural revolution, this provided the impetus for future changes, notably the increase in the middle class. However, the 18th century, after the death of Louis XIV in 1715, really meant a resurgence of the aristocracy, along with, like I said, the rise of the middle class. Okay, so what made you an aristocrat? It was not wealth per se. It was the fact that you were born into a particular status. You had certain privileges that were yours alone. For example, only you could wear a sidearm. Only you could wear certain colors of clothing. Aristocrats had their own courts where they were tried by their peers. Okay, they were also exempt from many forms of direct taxation. They paid some indirect taxes, but not direct taxes on their wealth. And aristocrats were especially strong in Eastern Europe, which became obviously an obstacle for Eastern European monarchs to be able to have to deal with. And aristocrats were primarily involved in the manorial system of growing crops, but increasingly they invested in businesses, commerce, and even manufacturing enterprises to supplement their increasingly extravagant lifestyles, which is symbolized in England by the country house. So if you visited England, the countryside, you've been to one of those famous places like Blenheim Palace or whatever, this is the perfect example. Country house, that's not a castle because it's not for fortification, but it's a way to show off your elegance, your refinement, and of course your status and your wealth at the same time. And one of these ways in which houses were changing now is the development of public versus private spaces. So, and we still have this concept. When you go to somebody's house, we don't really use these words anymore. You might go into the parlor, which is where you would greet guests. Now we call it a living room. And then there'd be private spaces, so like bedrooms, or maybe even just drawing rooms for the family to gather to play games. But it's not really a place for outsiders to be in, because the idea of privacy is important. It's this show place of intimacy and the connection among the family. Okay, so peasants were still the vast majority of the population in Europe, and they were really pretty much divided legally between free peasants, which just means that they could move about without being limited by law, or aristocrats, and unfree peasants, also known as serfs. There's kind of like an imaginary line in Central and Eastern Europe, the Elbe River, that kind of divides the free from the unfree peasants, although serfdom was coming under increasing criticism. Peasants' life was harsh. They paid tithes to the church, which added up to about 5 to 8%, taxes to the state. They had to pay duties to use things like the mill or the oven or the dovecote to keep their doves or something like that to the aristocrat. And they also had, the most resented part was a labor service that they had to either owe to the state or to the lord's land. So imagine somebody's requiring you to work on behalf of somebody else without any remuneration. You're not being paid for it. You just have to owe 2 days a week away from your land and your food to help somebody else. So this could end up being 50% of a peasant income. And of course, this was best symbolized by the gigantic estates of many Eastern European aristocrats, some of whom owned 50 to 100,000 serfs. And in this setting, as we talked about before, the village was really the center of life. So village would be somewhere between like 100, 200, 300 families. Oftentimes, although this was changing a little bit, they didn't have a whole lot of news and information from the outside world. They didn't have a lot of trade, except for people who passed through. So it was really a tight-knit social circle that you had in villages. And many villages resented towns or cities. They felt like towns and cities basically took all their people who migrated there, took all of their wealth, and didn't really give anything back in return. Peasant diet was pretty simple. It consisted of some of the black breads. They made gruels or stews. Didn't have a lot of red meat occasionally, and then maybe some vegetables and maybe occasional fruit during season. But it's not like our diet where we can get grapes any time of year because they come from Chile. You basically have to modify your diet based on the seasons. And so conditions for peasants in some ways worsened throughout the 18th century because of this aristocratic resurgence. And the best example is the gigantic Pugachev revolt in Russia, which is probably prompted by Catherine the Great selling off crown lands to boyars who then made serfdom worse, and peasants revolted as a result. Okay, so we usually associate towns and cities with bourgeoisie, and this is definitely more important in Western Europe. So you think of the major commercial countries, the Netherlands, France, England, etc. Those are mostly situated on the Atlantic. Cities did grow during the 18th century. This caused obviously a lot of problems from infrastructure. As I said before, this was not because of a natural increase in the birth rate in cities. It was mostly because of migration from the countryside. And most cities were not democratic. They were ruled by what are called patrician oligarchies, small groups of merchants or people who had inherited their status who monopolized most of the positions in government. And the middle class in cities was very diverse. So you could have really wealthy merchants. You could have professionals like jurists or attorneys, doctors. You could have small shopkeepers. So there's a lot of ways in which you could be a member of this sort of unique group of people between the peasantry and the aristocrats. And so the petty bourgeoisie were, like I said, these were probably people who owned shops or artisans and tradesmen who worked in one of the guilds, making whatever, barrels, shoes, blacksmiths, silversmiths. And then most cities had a pretty significant percentage of probably about 20% of people who were unskilled laborers who moved about from job to job. Maybe they unload, crates from a dock. Maybe they would help with construction projects and buildings and things like that. And as I said before, cities and towns, pretty unhealthy conditions. And obviously a lot of poverty and begging went on because of that. Okay, so education was beginning to change, but most people still attended, I use the term stale universities because they were still teaching, the focus was on the classics of the Greeks and the Romans, and this was coming under increasing criticism by the philosophes because it seemed impractical to a lot of people. And then secondary schools tended to be elitist because they were really only accessible to the wealthy classes. So some countries try to do something about that in a limited way. In Germany, they created Realschule, which basically means real schools, to try to teach people, maybe lower middle class people, practical skills so they could employ themselves or find some means to subsist. So in other countries, like traditionally Protestant countries were ahead of Catholic countries because of the emphasis on Bible reading, but Catholic countries are beginning to catch up. In Austria, Maria Theresa founded these so-called Volksschule, or people's schools. These are grammar schools to try to promote literacy. So literacy rates were increasing significantly in the 18th century among both men and women, although of course men led the way. And there were some universities like the University of Göttingen or Edinburgh or Leiden, which did teach the new science and were not limited to the classics of the Greeks and the Romans. So this is one of the most important phenomena of the 18th century, is a massive increase in the number of published books and periodicals and magazines and newspapers. And this is at the heart of the development of a new concept, which I'll mention here in just a minute. So a lot of these magazines and periodicals were targeted towards specific audience. Like there was a publication in England called The Spectator, and then there was even a female Spectator. So you can tell this when you go to if you subscribe to a magazine or some come to your house, or if you've seen them in a bookstore, they're clearly targeted towards certain audiences, but based on class or gender or whatever. So a female Spectator would have stuff about recipes or childcare, those sorts of things that a middle class woman would probably be interested in. And as I said, literacy rates were increasing significantly. So what makes this important is it helps to develop the basis for public opinion. People are reading more about politics, social issues. They're talking about them more, and they're talking about them more because they have venues to talk about them, like coffee houses, or lending libraries, or tea houses, or Masonic lodges. So what are they talking about? They're talking about the popularization of the new science. Not so much like lectures about physics, although that could take place too. It's just more the idea that the universe is not guided by supernatural forces, it's guided by the laws of nature. And just like, what does that mean for how I conceptualize myself within the universe or society? Or how do we solve problems based on that? Okay, so traditionally punishments in the absence of police forces and the absence of prisons had been to like put somebody in a jail and then administer some pretty violent punishment to them. So either corporal punishment or capital punishment or torture. The violent crime rate did go down a little bit in the 18th century, probably because of just increasing wealth. But there were continuing to be more property crimes, probably because of the maintaining high rate of poverty. So usually when somebody was convicted of a crime, it was a public execution. So, and obviously heinous ways. There were public executioners who tortured people for public spectacle. And part of that, of course, was to make an example out of them. So many people began to call for penal reform is basically just how do we punish criminals. So the idea was instead of having like these harsh punishments, we should reform their habits. The idea of rehabilitation, a reformatory or a penitentiary, which means basically against, it's making penance for what you've done wrong. So the most important figure here is Cesare Beccaria, who opposed the death penalty and basically believed that we should emphasize like the certainty of punishment and the respect for the law rather than fear of individuals and fear of other people. So it's kind of the beginnings of humanitarianism, a sense of like compassion or sympathy for people rather than, enjoying watching them being ripped limb from them. Okay. I don't want to overstate the advances in medicine because I don't really think that they were that huge. But one of the changes was the professionalization of medicine. So we used to have this idea of barber surgeons. So I don't know if you've ever seen there's an old SNL skit with Theodoric of York. He's a medieval barber, and he's also a doctor, right? So he cuts people's hair, and he does bloodletting, and he puts leeches on their forehead, and he does these like folk remedies, some of which are not even just ineffective, but are destructive. So the idea is that if you're a surgeon or you're a doctor, you should have your own professional organization which represents your interests, but also, more than that, like ensures that the people who are in that profession are well qualified. So one of the best places is the University of Leiden. So if you remember that painting by Rembrandt, the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp, that was at the University of Leiden. So surgeons became their own thing where they just cut hair and did anything related to hair care and personal hygiene. And now you had the Royal College of Surgeons and the Royal College of Physicians in England. And these organizations still exist, like we have the American Medical Association, among others of other smaller specialties. However, most people still got a lot of their medical care from whatever you want to call them, holistic healers. And this is still true today. Apothecaries who mixed up whatever you want to call it, potions or drugs. Faith healers who relied on religious things. Midwives still helped with birth, although increasingly as obstetrics and gynecology became like an actual field of medicine, men began to dominate that and push women out, which is ironic, of course, because women are the ones who give birth. Hospitals were still not great places to go. If you went to a hospital, especially before the understanding of infectious disease, and this is still true today, even with, I'm not even talking about COVID, like hospitals are places that have germs because they have people who are sick in them. And if the hospital doesn't have right protocols, you can easily get an infection from a surface rather than from another person. So hospitals at this time were reformed in the sense that they tried to have a more clinical approach to them. Same thing with the treatment of mental illness. But these are generally still places you probably want to be, hospitals and insane asylums. Okay, so then we have popular culture. And this is an important moment where we're going to have a branching off between elite and popular culture. So there is this idea, which I think is incorrect, at carnivals, like it's depicted here in the Peter Bruegel painting, nobles participate in this as well. So basically, you could argue that peasants and nobles inhabited a very similar cultural world. And popular culture became now more and more just kind of an activity of the masses or the lower classes. So carnival and other kinds of like festivals, which governments increasingly try to eliminate or regulate strictly, involve excessive amounts of drinking and eating and sexual activity and even aggression, which could sometimes morph into like actual revolts against states, which is why governments increasingly viewed them with suspicion. So the idea of the world turned upside down, where there's like role reversals, carnivals, for example, peasants dress like nobles and vice versa, men dress like women and vice versa, was to try to reinforce the social hierarchy by ritualizing this like turn the world upside down during a specific moment in time. But increasingly, this like violence that went along with it was, people were concerned about that. All right, one of the big advances here was the growth of spirits. Okay, so beer and wine are fermented from, obviously beer is fermented from a variety of different things: barley, malt, wheat, hops. Wine is fermented from grapes. But now you have like an increase in the production of grain, and so rather than having it spoil, a lot of it is fermented into these new spirits, which are higher in alcohol content, like vodka, which is obviously big in Russia, and then also gin in England. So a lot of places and taverns advertise like drunk for a penny and dead drunk for 2 pennies, and it became like a serious issue of like rampant alcoholism, not even just among men, which is traditionally the group that has the highest alcoholism rate, but also children drinking and mothers drinking. All right, so more and more elite culture is the culture of literacy. It's the culture of like the popularization of the new science that you would find in a coffee house or a Masonic lodge or a library. And so you have much more of this like kind of commercialization of leisure, which is basically like people finding consumer venues like a coffee house to spend their time and their money. And sometimes that could bring elite and popular culture together, but there was still kind of a divide when you have the masses interested in blood sports. So that's what the picture is here. It's basically like, bull and bear baiting. You just find a bear from the woods, and a lot of woods still had plenty of black bears in them, and you just stick a bunch of dogs on them and just watch the fun as the dogs try to attack the bear who's chained up. Cockfighting, which is taking 2 roosters and just watching them gouge each other's eyes out. And so a lot of this involved, or bare knuckle fisticuffs, 2 guys fighting with no boxing gloves on. And the reading material for the lower classes tend to be what are called chapbooks. These are cheap little books. They were kind of blue. They were about 24 pages, and they had just kind of like sayings and proverbs and almanacs, which is stuff about the weather. So not a real taxing reading. It's not a philosophical treatise. It's just something to amuse yourself. Tales of medieval knights or religious stories of saints, things like that. Okay, so this is really kind of pretty much one of the last slides here. So I just wanted to highlight some of the principles of the Enlightenment. So a lot of people call it the Age of Reason, the 18th century. And what they mean by that is like a systematic application of the scientific method toward the problems of human society, okay? In other words, let's make everything into a science. So if politics is something that we could study rather than just tradition, well, that's just the way it's been since the time of the Roman Empire, but can we make a study out of politics and turn it into political science? Why do governments take certain forms? What kinds of governments are more stable than others? What is a legitimate form of government? We've already seen that with Hobbes and Locke. But that's just politics. It could be any area of life. Then, really, as a reflection of the scientific method, is empiricism and the belief in quantification. We see this today. So it's the idea of like, where's the data? So a legitimate claim of knowledge has to have data behind it, like actual numbers, spreadsheets with correlations, okay? Like a poll, for a political poll. So this is the belief that knowledge that's based on sensory observation, because that's the kind of stuff that you can turn into data, is what really counts for a claim that you might want to make. Okay? Skepticism, really important, especially when we have new religious beliefs. So we're going to see that. We're going to see new religious beliefs like agnosticism, atheism, and deism. So skepticism is basically toward authority claims. So any authority, whether it's a religious authority, a political authority, a medical authority, an educational authority, so treat that with a degree of skepticism. Like, how do you know that? Where's the data? Rather than just deferring to these traditional people or institutions which have passed on their ideas and knowledge. And then secularism, which isn't necessarily anti-religious, it's just the belief that religion is more and more a private matter. It shouldn't be something the government gets involved with. The government shouldn't certainly support one particular religion over another. There should be religious tolerance. We should have generally like an approach toward problem solving or dealing with society's issues, not through the lens of religious belief, but through the lens of whether science or any other related field. By the way, this could easily be overstated. There were a number of religious revivals in the 18th century, like John Wesley in England or the Pietist movement in Lutheranism in Germany. So don't just go, everybody's secular. That's really not true. Most people are still pretty religious in the 18th century. And then there's the belief in natural laws. Like, Newton's the one who laid this all out in his Principia Mathematica. So if nature obeys like the 3 laws of motion and the theory of gravity, then why wouldn't we assume that we could find the similar laws for human affairs? So what are the natural laws of education? What are the natural laws of like just how humans interact with each other? Anthropology. And this is where we get what's called the social sciences. So they're really born in the 18th century. So we have some of them in our department, right? We have economics and we have government. So these are just ways of like taking a field of human endeavor and like making it into a science. So I'm a teacher, so if you're, although my path toward it was a little bit more unique, if you become a teacher, you have to go through an education program which treats education as if it were a social science. So I'll just make a little editorial here. I don't think education is a social science. I don't think it's a science at all. I think it's a craft. It's an art. And it would be better taught as a craft or an art. And just because something's an art or a craft, whether that's like, I don't know, auto mechanics or drawing, doesn't mean it's not lacking in value. Something doesn't have to be a science or a derivative of a science to have value. And sometimes when you impose a scientific framework on something that's not inherently a science or reducible to science, you distort it and it doesn't necessarily work out the best way. So why are we doing all this? Well, we're doing it because we are optimistic that if we apply these principles to human affairs, we will achieve progress. Human beings will get better. Our lives will be happier, healthier, longer lived. And this is, again, that Whig view of history. Like, it's the project of the Enlightenment, is the belief that by using a certain way of approaching knowledge and approaching problems that we have, we will get better. So, and this means, like, if we stay true to the principles of the Enlightenment, we will attain, maybe with twists and turns, this, like, linear view going forward. And by the way, I would just say that that's not the view that some cultures have. Like in China, if you're familiar with this, the mandate of heaven idea, is history is cyclical, okay? When a dynasty or even just like a new movement starts, it sort of germinates and it starts out sort of in a sense of immaturity, and then it reaches a higher degree of like stability, and then it reaches maturity and it's at its height, its apogee, but then it starts to decay and degenerate and has opposition to it, and then it starts to break down. And then there's usually violence and chaos, and then it's destroyed and it's replaced by a new thing. So the question is the like sort of Western view of history, which is linear, which is like we're always moving upward, more accurate than the Chinese view? I don't know that it is. All right, and then one of the principles also was equality, because basically the old regime was one that was just based upon and justified by hierarchy and privilege. You might remember the Great Chain of Being and the body politic. So even though the philosophes didn't want immediate equality because they recognized that most people weren't educated, they believed that you shouldn't have artificial like principles of inequality built into the system. So I just wanted to throw out, not everybody adopted the principles of the Enlightenment. There's also what's called the counter-Enlightenment, which is a criticism that the Enlightenment was going too far with its glorification of reason. So even though Rousseau is a figure of the Enlightenment, he's also a figure of the counter-Enlightenment. Edmund Burke, who later became a famous critic of the French Revolution, is also part of the counter-Enlightenment. There's a whole group of German thinkers of the so-called Sturm und Drang movement who emphasize more the idea of like intuition, emotion, the subjective nature of experience. So we still see this today. Like, just for example, movement of machine learning and artificial intelligence. So some people would say the best thing we could do is have our transportation systems, whether it's airplanes with autopilot or our automobiles with self-driving autonomous cars, would be the best idea. So I don't know that's necessarily the case. So here's a question that came up in our citizen club. I think it was last year. So let's say you're on an airplane and it has a significant problem. I don't know, maybe it lost an engine or maybe it lost 2 engines. Would you rather have like a really experienced pilot who's flown thousands of like flights, or would you rather have a machine that makes the decisions in those circumstances? So there was a person in Citizen Club, and they just unflinchingly said the machine. I strongly disagree. I'd rather have Sully Sullenberger land the plane on the Miracle of the Hudson, because there's a certain intuition that can't be reduced to like a binary system of algorithms. But that could just be me. But it's the kind of thing that comes from the Enlightenment, the idea that an algorithm that's produced by a machine that's a product of the scientific method and technology is an Enlightenment idea. The idea that intuition is more important is a counter-Enlightenment idea. Okay, so Immanuel Kant famously said, we live not in an enlightened age, but in an age of enlightenment. So what he meant by this is that we clearly haven't achieved the goal of enlightening all areas of life, but in this process of discussion and criticism, we are starting to identify the ways in which we can do that and accomplish it. So just kind of keep that in mind as you examine the various features and the thinkers of the Enlightenment.